I think DIY video and filmmaking is happening every second. Born in Flames would never have come into existence if the women in the film had had iPhones. Think about police brutality in Diamond Reynolds, whose boyfriend was being murdered as she calmly filmed the whole thing with her child in the back seat. Now we can see events happen on an international level. We know things from all over the world because of citizen journalists. Lizzie Borden, director of Born in Flames, 2019. A film podcast where we explore new perspectives on Black genre cinema and discuss alternative narratives in genre film through a Black lens. My name is Graham Cumberbatch, and this is episode 2. It is also the talkback for week 2 of our 4-part virtual film series hosted by Hyperreal Film Club out of Austin, Texas. All July, we invite viewers and listeners to watch along as we focus on a different Black film and a different genre of cinema each week, and discuss the film's impact and the contributions of Black filmmakers to the genre. At the end of each week, we'll be airing a new episode of Black is Not a Genre, featuring a great lineup of special guests. For week 2, we're discussing science fiction and Lizzie Borden's 1983 futuristic feminist polemic Born in Flames. And we are joined once again by Austin writer Ranita L. Miller. But before I introduce our guest, I want to give a special thank you to Hyperreal Film Club for hosting us as part of their summer programming. In addition to presenting an eclectic mix of the world's greatest movies, Hyperreal Film Club seeks to build a special community around the moving image. They specialize in creating unique movie-watching experiences in unusual, thoughtful, and immersive pop-up environments. Hyperreal also amplify local artists by screening the pieces they've already produced, as well as creating paid opportunities for them to create and exhibit new work. They're always looking for collaborators, so whether you have a short film or music video you'd like to premiere, or you're just looking to connect with other filmmakers, hit them up. Welcome to Black is Not a Genre. Here again, back-to-back weeks with Ranita L. Miller, actress, comedian, writer extraordinaire. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Thanks for hyping me up.
Always. It's my job. This is week 2 of our series in which we explore a different genre every week and a different Black film or Black-centric film in that category. This last week we did camp, and this week we're doing science fiction. Again, with all these genres, there are a lot of there's a lot of debate, a little bit of tension around what qualifies, what doesn't. A lot of differing definitions. I wanted to start with a few different definitions. This one, I believe, is by Isaac Asimov, which says, science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. There's another author and engineer, Robert A. Heinlein, who says, a handy short definition of almost all science fiction might read, realistic speculation about possible future events based solidly on adequate knowledge of the real world, past and present, and on a thorough understanding of the nature and significance of the scientific method. And then another definition from Lester Del Rey, even the devoted aficionado or fan has a hard time trying to explain what science fiction is. And the lack of a full satisfactory definition is because there are no easily delineated limits of science to science fiction. And that's the kind of quote I wanted to lead into, where there's this, I think what makes science fiction so cool and gives it such wide potential in film is that not only does it deal in the dual worlds of both, what we know or what we believe we know about the way the world works and what it could possibly look like in the future, but it also is through technology and through our imagination, it's in a sense limitless. It's ever expanding, and the fact that we can't easily define it is actually what makes it so incredible, and what makes it all the more in some ways infuriating that particularly in American sci-fi culture, how exclusionary it's been in terms of people of color, particularly Black people. And I always always say, like, uh, in terms of science fiction, it's in terms of you know you have this category of art where the only limits are your imagination, and your imagination can't include Black people. So what does that say about about what the way we're taught to think about human possibilities? Um, and that sort of brings us to our feature film, Born in Flames, which was released. I think she made it for about $70,000. The director is Lizzie Borden. She was a white female American artist who was really kind of embedded in the downtown New York art scene in the late 70s, 1980s, really involved in sort of the punk and no wave scenes and that art movement at the time. And she kind of started making this movie in response to what she saw as sort of rampant sexism and sort of the exclusion of women of color in particular from the art scene. And she kind of made this as a sort of punk manifesto about how she saw the current climate in terms of the exclusion of women, but also the extraction of sort of female labor, and then sort of churned out by the patriarchy. So you said, Ronnie, you said you saw this many years ago, but this was sort of a reviewing of it. What were your initial impressions having watched it again?
Well, let's see. I think the first time I watched it, it was purely for like aesthetic and music. I will say that for sure. So this time going into it, I definitely had more context for what I was going to see, and I think that helped me to follow along more with like, I mean, not there's not really a plot, but to follow more along with the storylines and understand, the 4 points of view that are being presented, well, at least four,
Mm-hmm.
and see just see different things that I didn't see before. Because again, mostly it was like, oh, the style is cool. I
Yeah,
like how
exactly.
everything is like edited really cool, and like the
Mm-hmm.
music is like badass, and it's got like Isabel Bertai and like all these people, So it's like there were so many other things that I got distracted with that I kind of was pulled away from that message. But now, especially in the current political climate, like everything is a parallel
Right.
almost to what's going on right now.
Exactly. So yeah, I think the aesthetic is the thing that jumps out, but there's a lot going on here, and it sort of, in a way, this is the ideal time to revisit a film like this. So the basic premise is it's the near future. This was written in 1983. It's about at the minimum 10 years into the future. There's been a socialist democratic revolution. Um, there is a new regime in order, and sort of they've established this new society in which they see themselves as systematically solving systemic oppression, and following a sort of not necessarily strict but very like staunchly protected socialist ideal. And it deals with, like you said, kind of four different factions of feminism, and this new world where there's still a sort of rampant abuse against women. There's a serious sexual assault problem. Um, there, throughout the liberation, women were involved in supposedly the fight for liberation, but now they're facing rampant joblessness, and all the sort of tenets that we think of as systemic oppression. So the different factions. There's Phoenix Radio, led by Honey. It's a mostly Black and queer Black woman brigade of women in pirate radio. Then there's Radio Ragazza, which is mostly white. They're sort of like punk poets. They also have a band. And then there's one of the more interesting, and I guess according to Borden, sort of ironic groups, was the Socialist Youth Review, which is mainly three like presumably college-educated white women who are very, I think their paper is essentially sponsored by the party. And so they have a lot of these sort of deep intellectual conversations, but and in the end they end up being highly theoretical because they also seem very distant from the women of color and the working class women who are kind of facing the brunt of this growing sort of resentment. And that's also the trio that includes a young Catherine Bigelow, and I think really her only acting role, but she and Boredom are friends. And then there's the Women's Army, which is kind of the central focus. And there's not really a main protagonist in the film, but Adelaide Norris is kind of the catalyst in the film's main action. And we kind of begin with her becoming increasingly militant, sort of becoming more frustrated at the escalation of violence against women, and the targeting of them for economic oppression. And she starts to sort of imagine more violent possibilities and starts to ask the questions of the role of potential organized violence in gaining political advances. And so she kind of systematically goes around to each of the other three groups and starts seeing if they want to join in sort of a coalition. And she gets varying responses. The Phoenix Radio is very supportive, but kind of hesitant to join another group when they're already doing certain things. And there's actually one of my favorite conversations between Honey and her other Black friend talking about the Women's Army. And Honey is kind of trying to give them a chance and wondering about, maybe this is sort of the thing. And her friend, she talks about, specifically, there's a scene in which there's a attempted sexual assault, and one of the tactics that the Women's Army is doing in terms of interrupting these assaults has been riding around on bicycles with whistles. And in a lot of ways it's very effective, but the woman having the conversation with Honey is just like, I don't, what they did? They just rode around on bicycles. Like, what is that? And Honey is just, she's like, okay, listen, if the sisters were in charge, it wouldn't go down like that. But I think they have a certain agenda that's worth hearing.
Wait, is that when she says that it's not mature enough
She
for her?
did. So her famous
Yeah.
line is like, they're not mature enough to hang out with me. So we already see this sort of like conflict between so the Black ideas of feminist revolution and the sort of coalition that's being tried, that's trying to be built. I think Borden is one of the things that she does that's really effective is she doesn't really work with the script. And she talked about that in terms of one of her main things that she wanted to focus on was, who is the most affected by these sort of regimes. And it's Black women, particularly Black lesbians. And one of the things she didn't want to do is sort of put words in their mouth. So a lot of these conversations that take place in the film are completely improvised. And along with the sort of montage editing and like pseudo documentary footage, they sort of create this very frenetic punk aesthetic. But I think it reads pretty well. What did you think about her use of improvised dialogue and sort of communicating these messages?
I enjoyed it. I think it was great because it kept the language simple and made it easy for any audience to be able to understand.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like critics probably hated that because they wanted like deep philosophical arguments about Marxism and shit like
Yeah,
that. But I think for the main protagonist of the story, it like read true to their lives because most of their activism is going to be out of lived experience as opposed to
right.
scholarship. So I think you can see the contrast between them and then the women that work for the socialist newspaper, because
Mm-hmm.
they're sitting there and they're so concerned about things being divisive that they can't even understand the things that they are fighting for that are the same, and they can't understand that if it's not going to be us at the bottom, it's going to be somebody
Yeah,
else.
exactly.
So we can't be like nitpicky on what we're going to focus our energies on. We can't ask one one particular group within the struggle to take the back seat unless it is the dominant group in that struggle, which would be white women in this case.
Exactly. No, I think that in particular the Socialist Review, Youth Review women, I mean, Borden was very explicit as saying that that was kind of an ironic stand-in for her and her evolving ideas around feminism. She's like, I was reading a lot of Marxism at the time, and I wanted to sort of, those characters kind of parallel my journey through just being sort of this sort of angry and theoretical to understanding, and to sort of, you know, be awakening to the absence of Black women from these discussions and what that means as far as the trickle down effect of oppression. And I think she takes great pains to sort of to connect this sort of struggle for women's liberation and critique the sort of what we consider, or what people were considering at the time, sort of liberation labor. You know, the opening scenes where it's kind of like B-roll of women throughout the city just doing their jobs and going to work, and she's making an effort, I think, to connect these sort of struggles to the theory and say that there's a certain amount of labor that's going on that's happening on the same level, even though we don't consider that. And there was a line, I think, where the women of the Socialist Review were discussing, you know, their issues with the women's liberation, and some of them were, you know, they're too focused on women's liberation and not on the full picture of the revolution. Another one was saying they're too reactionary, and one of them actually had a nice insight where she said, you know, maybe what we consider too reactionary or too separatist has more to do with the way we consider the work in terms of feminist revolution, and how we tend to separate these things out in terms of, you know, what is a considered and delicate approach, as opposed to, you know, the reaction in the moment as being the actual statement, as being the actual platform, which I think has a particular effect on being more inclusive in terms of the way, in terms of including Black resistance in the overall discussion. I think one of the things that is tricky when talking about science fiction is just really the lack of examples in literature and film in terms of the inclusion of both Black characters and issues specific to Black communities of Black people. Octavia Butler has a famous essay, "Why is Science Fiction So White?" She wrote in 1980. And the premise comes from a professor she had in class where it was a creative writing class, I think, in the 1960s, and they were like, don't include Black characters unless their inclusion has something specifically to do with their Blackness. And they went on to suggest, well, if you want to discuss issues of race, consider replacing the Black characters with aliens as a way to, I guess, create a certain intellectual distance. And Octavia Butler, just to read an excerpt, she says, but first, some answers to the question, why have there been so few minority characters in science fiction? Let's examine my teacher's reason. Are minority characters, Black characters in this case, so disruptive a force that the mere presence of one alters a story, focuses it on race rather than whatever the author had in mind? Yes, in fact, Black characters can do exactly that if the creators of those characters are too restricted in their thinking to visualize Blacks in any other context. This is the kind of stereotyping, conscious or subconscious, that women have fought for so long. No writer who regards Blacks as people, human beings with the usual variety of human concerns, flaws, skills, hopes, etc., would have trouble creating interesting backgrounds and goals for Black characters. No writer who regards Blacks as people would get sidetracked into justifying their Blackness or their presence unless such justification honestly played a part in the story. It is no more necessary to focus on characters' blackness than it is to focus on a woman's femininity. And I think that quote was right at the intersection of the sort of ideas that Born in Flames is playing with, in terms of the side. Mainly, she kind of turns the question on its head, because ideally, this sort of white professor is saying that it's disruptive to the story. And it's a lot of what the socialist review characters are saying too, where it's like, if you make sort of Black women the central focus of a movement, or even the leaders of a movement, then you're shifting the focus or the conceptual centering to this idea of Blackness that can be a distraction. It's something we hear this all the time. It's divisive, it's a distraction. And Octavia Butler, in a way, is saying, yes, it is disruptive, and that's also the point. The reason it is actually perfect to focus on these things, particularly in sci-fi literature, is that it puts into perspective a sort of explosion of assumptions and a disruption of what we conceive of as up and down in terms of these political issues we're dealing with, that doesn't allow you to sit comfortably in your own assumptions and biases. What did you think about how the film centered Black women characters, and in terms of both the narrative and in terms of the way its impact on sort of where it sits in science fiction?
Well, I'll say first that it was interesting to see that the women that were the focus of the film, their skilled labor was in typically male-dominated like fields.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they were cut from work, of course, they were the first ones to be let
Right.
go. And so I think when we think of anything, we have to remember there's always especially in a capitalist society, and even in this society, which was 10 years after this supposed revolution, there still has to be someone on the bottom of the pecking order or
Right.
whatever. And so you can just swap it out for anybody. And I think that's what people tend to forget is, if it's not us, it's going to be somebody else. And you should be able to see the universal in the struggle, because it's a struggle. It's still oppression. You should be able to understand that. And I think of when people go, Black people are getting killed disproportionately by cops, and people go, well, white people are getting killed too. The problem isn't anything to do with race, really. The problem is what the police officers are killing people and nobody fucking cares. Like, that's the
Exactly.
issue. And so people want to get caught again at this intersection because they don't understand. And I think it has to do, especially when you think about science fiction and it mostly being set in the future.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's present doesn't have color in it, they can't have that in the future either. So I think that's what science fiction suffers from, is lack of diversity in the people who are writing these stories, or the people who are getting published. And so they can't see a future in these people because they can't see a present with these people. It's as simple
Yeah.
as that.
No, I think that's exactly it. And towards that end, there's also discussion to be had about, white directors making Black-centered sci-fi material. And there's a sort of, coupled with the extreme dearth of Black-directed sci-fi films. There's a smattering of sci-fi films made by Black directors, and there's starting to be a lot more, but there are also an interesting number of films directed by white directors that deal with Black issues. Most notably is Brother from Another Planet, directed by John Sayles. They're one of what's considered the first entirely Black cast sci-fi film was in 1940 called Son of Ngagi, and that was directed by a white director, but it was written by a man named Spencer Williams, who was a Black actor and a future director. His first film, The Blood of Jesus, is considered an early classic for Black film. So, I guess in that context, it is interesting in terms of, it's really easy when people produce art, particularly, white directors, to sort of see who they surround themselves with. And one of the things that struck me about Lizzie Borden's is that, her scene, one of the things that brought her to make this film and to center it around Black queer women was realizing how absent they were from her current scene. And towards that end, she talks about, and one of the ways in which she did casting was literally just riding around the city. Like she found the woman who played Adelaide Norris, Jean Satterfield. She found her playing basketball at the McBurney Y, which, side note, is actually where my dad went to high school.
Oh, cool.
This was in the 80s, and she found Honey was already a known figure in the art world, but she found a lot of other people just hanging around lesbian bars, and she ended up casting a lot of non-actors. So I think there's, one of the things I talk about in the piece on Hyperreal Film Club is there's a duality to that. There's a sense in which, I think it's important that she did the work in terms of the art, but it also sort of highlights one of the potential pratfalls of films like this, where white directors are in a situation of trying to include something that's not already naturally in their orbit. And I, in a lot of ways, I think her choices, as far as particularly as far as scripting, help dissipate that effect. But there were a couple of moments where I wasn't sure if it was intentional satire or if it was something that got missed. There was the host of Radio Ragazza. There were two moments, and one in which you probably know what I'm talking about. Like she's reciting a poem, but she's essentially rapping, which is in the early days of hip hop. In some ways, it makes sense because it's like the downtown art scene with those were actually the first people to interact with hip hop through people like Fab Five Freddy
and Blondie.
And Blondie, because those are some of the first clubs that hip hop artists were allowed to headline. But she follows it up in another scene where she does a radio thing where her hair is braided in cornrows, and
yes.
So it's like, in a sense, it's like that could be a really interesting critique, particularly for her character, if intentional in that, because one of the first things we know about the women's art is that it's mostly led by Black lesbians, and Radio Ragazza's stance on it, particularly through her, who's sort of like the lead singer of the band for them, is that she doesn't feel they're radical enough. She's, her quote is that they're all rhetoric and no action. And so there's a sense in which this white woman who feels like she's too radical for this mostly Black lesbian group, is when she is adopting her own persona of radicalness, is appropriating heavily from Black culture and Black symbols of rebellion and resistance. And she has that moment when she decides to sort of finally join the coalition, where she's looking for Honey, and she enters this bar where they're all hanging out and all the Black women are playing pool, and they're very like intentionally cold to her, like, I don't know who you're looking for. And she has this sort of confrontation, sort of internal confrontation, where it's like there's a difference between sort of assessing your own radicalness theoretically of Black groups and then being confronted with the Black body itself, and sort of there's this sort of coming to a head of this appropriation that happens in isolation, and then like what happens when there's no wall between the two. But I don't know how intentional that was. What did you think about that? Obviously, I'm sure you noticed.
I mean, I hope it was intentional. I think,
Yeah,
especially in, again, the times that we're living in right now, especially when we see protests, we know who the brunt of the force is going to fall upon.
exactly.
But I think there's this excitement for radical ideas and radical action, but the people don't want whatever result, that which is usually violence. They don't want that
Yes,
blowback. And I think even in that character, Isabel, she's rah 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 until her radio station gets burnt down. And then
exactly.
it's like, now we got to be on the move, now we have to
Uh-huh.
protect our, like, now we have to be more secure. But it's like, exactly, it's like you don't fully understand what what happens when you try to overthrow
Right.
any system that's of power. And so it's really easy to get swept up in the idea, but the execution is where a lot of people fall down. And I think right now we're seeing it in state sanctioned violence that's going on everywhere. And it's like, do you want to go to those protests now when
Hmm.
you might lose an eye? Do you want to go to those protests now when you might get like caught up by some random federal agent and takes you somewhere that nobody knows where you are? Like the the danger is now real and they can feel it. And I think that's the difference between someone who lives every day and being aware of that violence and someone who thinks that that violence is the revolution.
Yeah,
When it's
exactly.
like, there's a lot more. There's a lot more to that. There's always going to be a response.
Yes, there's always a blowback, and the film highlights that from the beginning because there are all sorts of different factions of sort of feminist and women's liberation um, movements going on in the city at the time of the film, or in the film, sorry. But there's a reason why this sort of shadowy federal figure that we see sort of flipping through surveillance footage of Adelaide at the end. There's a reason why they're focused on the women's army and why they're focused on Adelaide in particular, because blackness and queerness always represent the biggest threat to the state because it's upheld by white supremacy. And the sort of thread through the film is that even in this sort of, which again is very prescient to today's times in terms of people's hopes in a socialist revolution behind people like Bernie Sanders. And the general message of the film is like, it's not the regime or the philosophy necessarily that sort of magically transports or magically transforms this, what we think of as these issues. If we don't start with the people at the bottom, then it's just going to keep repeating itself. But Adelaide as a sort of central figure, and it sort of harkens back to movements like the Black Panthers, where the Black Panthers were a very small movement, but they were, and because obviously there's a certain erasure that happens in terms of sexism, but I think a lot of what isn't known, one of the things that isn't as widely known about the Black Panthers Party is that it was, in terms of numbers, dominated by Black women,
Hmm.
and there is a connection between that and why they were targeted so heavily for essentially just state assassination. And so the opening sequences of surveillance are immediately kind of evoking that, the sort of isolation of Black movements, regardless of how effective or how small they are, because they will always be considered the bigger threat. Um, and then Adelaide, as you were throwing to the sort of, not the climax, but the sort of central combustion of the film is when she's sort of ghosted away to the tombs. She mysteriously ends up dead, and the state issues a statement claiming that it's a suicide. And that ends up being the catalyst for all four factions to sort of to figure out what they can do together, because none of them believe it, obviously. And there are sort of instant recognizable parallels to Sandra Bland. And I think one of the more powerful things about the film is a repositioning of Black women as the frontline targets of police violence. Whereas I think in the national sort of mainstream white dominant conscience, that's actually Black men, in terms of the more famous Black men male assassinations of the civil rights movement being the more famous. All the more famous recent examples of Black men dying at the hands of police are men. And you can kind of see that replicated in the different public responses from about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I think one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about recently is, and I think someone mentioned this on Twitter, and that maybe one of the reasons why we consider state violence against Black men first instead of women when it's actually more rampant against women is that there's this confluence of factors where, because women's work is considered is excluded often from the public sphere, where their primary roles take place in interior spaces like the home or hospitals, or yes, they're in offices, but they're not necessarily the sort of public facing. Whereas a lot, because of economics or socialization, Black men tend to, even on sort of poverty levels, tend to do a lot of their role playing or working roles in public, in the streets. So their deaths tend to become more of a public spectacle. Whereas if you look at a lot of, and starting with Breonna Taylor, a lot of the Black women in recent years who've been killed by the police have been killed in their own homes. And there's a certain danger to that, in terms of, what we see are the things caught on tape. And if, one of the first things everyone says, imagine what's happening not on camera. And what's happening not on camera is disproportionately affecting Black women. There's this sort of, the interiorness of what's considered women's work is essentially a trap, where the state can do whatever they want to Black women and no one can find out about it. And we sort of see that mirrored in this film. What did you think of Adelaide's character in terms of her, when she goes to the south, or what is it, the West Sahara, and
Western Sahara, yeah.
Western Sahara, she meets with another
Radical women's army,
army
or
across the
militant.
world, to sort of, she has this sort of like pilgrimage where she talks to the leader there, and there's some really interesting conversations there about how the militant leader there gives her some advice in terms of being prepared for what the violence means. She's gives her some advice on preparing for how the media is going to gaslight her, which is foreshadowing for what happens when she herself gets killed. And one of the things she says is, the media will have you defending yourself against things that aren't actually the threat.
Right.
What did you think about that whole sequence?
Well, there's a few things in that. Well, with Adelaide, again, I saw the parallels between like the young leaders of the Black Panther Party and,
Mm-hmm.
her age of being like 24. And so it just brought into light that just their age in general. Like every time I think about like the
Yeah.
Black Panthers, I'm like blown away by how like they were undergrads. Like most of them were like undergrads, and they had these amazing vision. And then of course the women in the background doing like the school lunch programs, and
Mm-hmm.
all the tutoring and all those things that they did for the community organizing. Are you still
I'm
there?
still here. The
Okay.
camera's just waiting
So
out.
so that they've done for the community organizers. And then when you think of the civil rights movement, that's another thing, that a lot of the leaders that are still alive today say, that the women were in the background really doing the work. Who was putting up MLK when he came to town? Who was cooking him soul food? Like, who was doing all those things? And you kind of see those people too, like in the church. And then when there's like the lady with the ushers, like all white, walking across the street.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like those are the people that I kept kind of, you could see them like in the distance, or in the in the shadows of the film. I think the only like older generation woman was the character played by Flo Kennedy, or
Yes.
what is her name, the
Zella
Wiley.
Wiley.
Yeah, Stella Wiley. And so like, again, it's all grassroots from the youth. But we also have to think about, like, when you were talking about science fiction being like, the scientific method, you have a hypothesis, you
Mm-hmm.
try to, prove it or disprove it. That is what all these revolutions are.
Exactly.
Our hypothesis, like everything, and I think people forget that when they think of sci-fi, that political science is science, the social sciences are
Mm-hmm.
science. And I think that's probably also part of that disconnect, where they're like, race shouldn't be included because I guess they only think about robots and
Yeah,
and
exactly.
machines.
Right.
So I think that's what's funny. It's like, well, you're not actually understanding even the full breadth of what science is. So
Right.
how can you even say these things? And then also when you're talking about the media and how they continuously mocked women like
Mm-hmm.
throughout the film, like when they were talking about, so I guess it was harassment or something like that, and then he's like, I hope she gives, or maybe she'll give me
Maybe
her
she'll give
number, or
her a
they'll send me
number.
her number or something like that. And it's like they're continuously mocking the women's movement. But also I was thinking back around, I mean, not 1983, but like maybe in the late 90s or early 90s, when the big thing was sexual harassment,
Yeah.
and how like how they mocked that, and it was this big story, but it was always like, well, he just asked her out on a date at the water cooler, and they kept minimizing what it
Yeah.
was. And you're just like, okay, nobody was saying like it was the guy that asked me out at the water cooler, it was the boss that pinched my butt, or like
Exactly.
other things, but everyone wanted to reduce it down to something so trivial. And it's gaslighting. And I think we have to remember that I think a lot of movements want us to be the same, but we have to know that we're not the same, because everybody's struggle is a little bit different. And
Exactly.
those differences are what makes their struggle different. So we can't blanket statement. There's not a blanket solution, and we have to prioritize again those voices that are at the bottom.
No, I think yeah, that's exactly it. You, you said it all. There's a certain I don't know. I think it can be a little bit confusing, but so at the core of this film is what we sort of consider now. There's it's sort of a hotly contested concept, but about intersectionality, particularly
Right.
within the feminist movement. Um, and
So I feel like honestly with this film, to update it now, it would
mhm,
need to focus on like Black trans women.
right. I think so.
And
I
they
think
and I
there's a
don't think that
new.
they were represented at all in this film in that way.
Well, that's interesting. I think they weren't, in a sense, um, but I also think there were moments when that also came to the fore. Borden talks about this in an interview too, where um, she mentions the fact that it's not just that there are a lot of things that were discussed in the film that there wasn't a lot of public language available to them discussing it. And she actually does mention, that's a great point. She actually does mention that there are a lot of issues, particularly involving intersectionality, which she feels like the film was maybe even discussing before it had a term for it. Because the term, God, what is her name? The essay about intersectionality wasn't, I don't think it was coined until
So like
86 or
yeah, like the
89.
late 80s
um,
maybe.
and that was 6 years after this was written. um,
But I
yeah,
also think if you think about that idea, you can see it right now when we talk about Black trans women, and there's so much homophobia in the Black community, there's so much patriarchy in the Black community. It almost seems like in most movements somebody just wants to replace the oppressor. So if you
right,
think of like Black liberation, for all those, I don't know, black male chauvinists, whatever you want to call them, like they want to be the top guy. If we think about the women's movement, especially in this movie, a lot of it was about career advancement and the glass ceiling and those things. So it's like, do you just want to be the boss? Like, or do
yeah.
you want equality? Because it seems like you just want to be the boss. Seems like you just want to make the same money as the white guy. You
No,
don't
I
really
mean
want equality.
it's the whole girl boss philosophy, where it's this.
Mhm.
And a lot of women in particular have been called out about it recently, or the people, whoever the head is at the wing. And
Yep.
it's like this idea of like, and it has to do with this sort of embedded whiteness. And so this idea that women's liberation means, owning your power and asserting your agency, but with a sort of lack of understanding of how you could be just replicating white patriarchy in a different plane. Kimberl Crenshaw, I don't know why I couldn't remember her name, was that at her sort of coining of the term happened in 1989. There's an interesting quote regard to what you're talking about the sort of primacy of Black trans issues, where she says women were attempting to make contact across class, gender, and race lines, sort of unknowingly practicing intersectionality. But so much wasn't talked about because there wasn't the language for it at the time. For example, there are women in the film, some of whom had gender non-specific names like Ryan, Marty, Pat, who might have used pronouns other than she, but it wasn't necessarily possible at the time. And gender reassignment was wildly expensive. One could go to another country and have a sex change like Christine Jorgensen, who was really famous at the time, but otherwise that wasn't feasible. And I'm still asked, who's that guy about the photo in Honey in the film poster? So there is a sense in which they touch on it without really explicating it. There's not a lot of exposition about it, but there's also where's the scene where Adelaide steps in on the woman who's being harassed on the subway, and the guy's first thing is, what are you, man or woman?
Yeah.
And so there are all these sort of references, and the references are very violent. But I think you're right. I think if there were to be an update of this, that would have to be more explicit in terms of, in the way where, especially now where people are sort of just being awoken to the idea that it's Black trans women have been on the bottom, and by extension, the first line of state violence, not only state violence, but domestic violence and intracultural violence for decades. It's nothing new. It's just that we're now sort of becoming more aware of it.
I also like that scene when the guy's accosted on the train, because he acts so like it's his right to do that.
Yes,
And why are these
exactly.
women interrupting? This is my right as a man on this train to
It's
do
like,
that.
excuse me, I'm working here.
Exactly. I also, it reminds me of this dumb thing. I had a friend that lived in New York, and he refused to ride the trains with the orange and yellow seats.
Oh my God.
So like I was thinking of that too when I'm looking at the train, like, oh damn, those trains are that old.
They're really
Now I
old.
get it. So like, and what neighborhoods do those trains run in, by the way?
Exactly. Like, where do those go?
Yeah.
No, I think there's a, when we're talking about sci-fi from a sort of bird's eye view, there is a way in what you talked about where people, the early definitions I read were, it's about the scientific method, and there has to be the sort of concrete basis in what we conceive of as scientific fact. And like you said, there's this failure to acknowledge political and social sciences as a playground for science fiction, as they've always been considered sort of secondary sciences, or in a lot of ways academically, sciences for women. And there's a way in which the exclusion of those things from the canon of sci-fi disproportionately affects Black artists, particularly Black women artists. So I think this film, goes a long way towards turning that on its head. I wanted to
I also enjoyed that the leadership within the women's movement was so decentralized, because it reminds me now of like Black Lives Matter, and they're like,
exactly.
who is the leader?
Exactly.
Who is the guy? And it's like, there is no guy.
No
What
one.
are you talking
That's
about?
the point.
That's the whole point. And I think we saw that too with Occupy Wall Street. We saw that
Mm-hmm.
there, and it's like, what? They don't know what to do when there's no central leader, which is very funny to me. And also I like the way that a lot of times in the editing, two like conversations were kind of overlapped.
Yeah.
Which just kind of reminds me of today and how we speak to each other, and even like the addresses that the radio personalities were making, like straight to the camera. It just reminded me of how we speak to the ether now.
Exactly.
When we talk about
how we're
anything
talking right
online.
now.
Exactly. And then also just like you don't know who's receiving your message, but you also now everybody wants to be right, so everybody's just over each other because
Mm.
they don't care. They're just trying to prove their point or be the victor in the conversation. So I
No, I
think she
mean
does a good job of showing that with the editing.
that was exactly what I was kind of talking about next. I think the
Yeah.
craft of the film is no, I think it's perfect. The craft of the film and sort of it really brings it's a really great example of the embeddedness of the medium and the message. I think the way that she crafts this film is really important. Like you talked about with uh, the overlapping audio with the text, particularly in the way it crosses over with with surveillance and what they're actually and what the women are actually talking about. I think that is it's a great metaphor for the way in which these conversations are happening, and she creates her own sense of geometry. I think one of the things I talk about in the essay is that there's the concept of intersectionality, and that sort of conjures different anytime you talk about intersection, it conjures these ideas of meeting points, but it's still in its language, it constitutes a sort of singularness. And one of the things that she talked about, there's a quote from another thing she said in the talk about the film asks if different groups of women who want similar things can band together, not in a unified but in a parallel way, to overcome various patriarchies, because there is not just one patriarchy. um, and the overlapping audio, the way she sort of seamlessly stitches together uh, found footage versus film that footage that looks like surveillance. You can't really tell what was filmed for the film and what wasn't. She's creating these sort of this world in which everything is happening all at once. It's not this sort of linear idea of this. There's a what's the word, protagonist who starts the action and then reaches the climax and then finishes the action, and everyone else is sort of ancillary. It's like everyone is the protagonist all at once, and they're all having these conversations simultaneously and all doing the work simultaneously. And the sort of conventional knowledge which the sort of party leaning socialist review characters is that that's too disjointed, that you can't actually make progress if everyone's on their own wavelength. If all the communities are operating, there has to be a central hub. But obviously what's wrong with that is anytime these movements get centralized, we know who ends up in charge and we know who
Right.
ends up not having a say. And so I think this idea of parallel dialectics is really uh, interesting. And a lot of ways, like you said, sort of sees the future in terms of different structures and the way we interact on social media. But I thought that was a kind of a powerful metaphor.
They also had like kind of a system to combat that within the women's movement with when they draw the circle on the board and he's got like all the circles around the circle and he's talking about that they rotate every 3 months and
Yes,
like
yes.
everybody moves and
Hmm.
then they all vote for a leader but that leader rotates too. So that was like an interesting system that they had come up with, I thought. And when I try to think about like who has a central message now, like
Yeah,
the only person I can really think of is our president.
exactly. And we see the
And I was
problem with
like, I
that.
really didn't want to say it, but like seriously, like I think that's the only real place where we know a lot of people from a lot of different viewpoints are actually meeting and seeing like information
Yes.
from that source. Like everywhere else, it was like they had radio. They realized that everybody was watching TV, so they needed to take over the
Uh-huh.
television stations. But we can't do that now because there's podcasts and like live streams and like all kinds of different things that are conflicting. So how can we get that attention?
Right.
It's like we're in a whole different world, so everything has to be a parallel.
Right.
you know
There's no, and we see that centralizing these ideas restricts the perspective and is dangerous for people like us.
Mhm.
I wanted to talk a little bit. I guess we should talk a little bit about cosmic slop and space
Last thing I want to
traders.
say,
Go ahead.
Black women be ready, white women get ready, red women stay ready. I
Yeah,
love
that
that quote.
was it. Isabel's quote? No, it was.
No, it's Honey,
It's
I
Honey's
think.
quote.
Yeah, I just love it.
All
I
her
don't love
lines are really
the
good.
red women. I don't love the red women, phrase, but I get the sentiment.
Absolutely. 1 second.
And I also love the like memorization that the kids are going through about like alternative. It's not alternative history. It is history, but the history that we're not usually taught in school, because that also was just reminiscent of like reading and seeing things about the Black Panther Party and other like Black liberation movements, because a lot of building that self-worth was through like learning these ideas and just repeating them over until they like stuck. Oh, we
Make it
didn't even
roaming.
talk about how great the music in this like movie is. They play Born in Flames like a billion times.
Right.
I like
Good
the
song.
song. It's all right. It's a good song. Um, the Bloods song is also played almost equally as much as Born in Flames. So I feel like the alternate title for this movie could have been Undercover Nation because they play that song almost just as much.
What's the which one? What song is that?
It's well, it's the song that Isabel's band sings.
Oh, right. Yeah, I guess they do play that
Yeah,
a lot. They
they
play
play it a
different
lot.
snippets of it.
Yeah.
Um,
They just had like great musical choices though, like stable singers. They had like the OJs, like, and that was also curious to me, like how did they get the
I was thinking
licenses
about
for this
that too.
music? Because I know that you have Killer of Sheep maybe in your thing, and I'm thinking like that movie is amazing, but it didn't even get distribution because of the
Because of the
clearances
music.
for the music.
And
So it's like interesting that $70,000 film got those.
it makes me wonder like if it did, but I guess they did. I don't know.
They had to.
There
They had a lot of reggae. They had
they
like
had a lot
just
of
all
reggae.
kinds of great, like Althea and Donna, like
They
just
didn't
so much
play a
good stuff.
lot of they only played sections of it. I don't know how she did that. That was
Yeah.
actually one of the first
There
questions
was even
I would
Stevie
love to
Wonder. Like
ask
they
her.
had everything in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to know more
It
about
was
how that
definitely
came
like
out.
this weird pirate radio effect. I'm just like, how did they get away with all this if there's no way they paid for it all with
I feel like the only
$70,000.
voice that was missing was Nina Simone.
Yeah, she was not in
But
it.
that's just me. That's
I
just
mean,
my opinion.
when the news was reporting Adelaide's death, they were playing Strange Fruit in the background.
It was the Billie
Um,
Holiday version.
yeah,
But I
it's
mean, not
it's
that that's
complicated.
terrible. Like that's not a bad thing either.
Oh no, I was just saying. Oh, you were talking about
Yeah.
Nina Simone. No, I was just talking about the
Yeah.
song, but just another song that they were playing.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is kind of an obvious choice, but
yeah. Well, I
again,
think
I
that's another
understand.
thing that's interesting about the film is there's a lot of there's a certain tension between like the metaphorical and the didactic. There are certain ways in which it's not afraid to be explicit, and other ways where it's alludes to certain things and kind of showing instead of telling. I think yeah. I mean the only reason I was gonna transition to Space Traders was just in that kind of dichotomy, whereas Space Traders is a very um, it's a very blunt allegory, whereas Born in Flames is more of a sort of it's a more avant-garde sort of treatise on like what on like the entire milieu of the sort of political sciences. Um, I think in a lot of ways in some ways there's a certain parallel in terms of centering Black trauma in this sort of future that purports itself to be something that it's not. Um, but we can talk about that in those two in conjunction. I think. What did you think of Space Traders? Had you seen it before?
No, I hadn't. It was amazing.
Yeah, I
I
hadn't
really
either. It
liked
was
it.
wild.
It was, oh my God, I was like laughing out loud the whole time. I just thought it was so hilarious. And I mean, I already knew the black people were fucked. Like I just knew.
Yeah, you just
And so
from the
it was
beginning.
like, right. So like the whole time, like y'all can do whatever the hell y'all want. You're not gonna save your ass. So like watching it from that viewpoint was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I think most people of color would watch it from that way. I don't know. I think some people would think that there was hope, but there was never any hope. It had a lot of, like Robert Guillaume, like all these
Some
people in
really
there that
notable
you would be
actors.
surprised, which was also really cool. And I think again, there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, we hear it every day. Someone getting told to go back where you came from, all this stuff. Like this is not a sentiment that is foreign to the United States. When we think about the Civil War and after the Civil War, they were actually legitimately considering sending all the black people back to Africa.
Exactly.
The Confederates could stay, but the black people that helped fight the war had to go back to where they came from. So it's not like these ideas are just super like out there. These are pretty realistic, honestly. I mean, we put the science twist on it with like UFOs and stuff, but
Right.
again, real themes here.
No, I think there's a there's a certain irony at play there. And you're right, it is this sort of a dark comedy. Like I don't know if you watched Twilight Zone growing up. I think I watched it every now and then, not very often, but the sort of
I watched it. I think the first episode I ever saw of Twilight Zone, the dude goes to like an internment, like a Jewish internment camp.
mhm,
It was like I think it was like he was like seeing ghosts. And so, I know that it really like scarred me for a little bit, but no, I really appreciate the Twilight Zone, and like I think it's also interesting to watch this movie when we think about Jordan Peele's like reboot of the Twilight Zone, which I have
right.
not watched, but I want to. So I wonder how much this series of films like impacted that Twilight Zone series, or if it did at all.
No, I mean I'm wondering, yeah, I would think this would be a part of Peele's research.
Yeah.
It's weird because it's sort of a forgotten film. I had no idea it existed. It was my first time watching it. It came out in 1994. It was directed by the Hudlin brothers. It was a three-part anthology that um, premiered on HBO. And the idea was to be sort of like a Twilight Zone, uh, a Black Twilight Zone. And the first film in the and short film in the anthology is Space Traders, and it's based on a short story with the same name by Derek Bell, who's a sort of professor and civil rights activist. Um, and the premise is really kind of it's supposed to be shocking, and in a way, it's like the idea that it's both shocking and expected is what's at play here. And I think the first thing you sort of notice, um, other than the the first funny thing you notice is that the aliens choose this weird Reagan-looking avatar to communicate with
Yes.
the United States, and this like Ronald Reagan impersonator, appealing to what they feel like is what they think of as what humans might think of as like who their leader might be.
I
Um,
mean, it's not too far from our current truth either.
no,
Like,
it's
I mean, I
not at
know that
all.
he was our president, but I mean, we got a reality show host after we had a Hollywood actor.
It's all the same thing. The sort
Yep.
of parallels to current times are really kind of excruciating. Like there's, the first place we go after the aliens make their offer, um, is the president's war room, and they there's this sort of silence, and then all this sort of we go around the room and everyone is basically like, this is crazy, but food stamps would be down, and unemployment and drug programs the costs would be cut, and then immediately one of the first things is they start to frame it. The white people in the room start to frame it as a potential act of service, which is where it starts getting really dangerous and eerie, and also very easily related to what's happening today with the pandemic and this idea of essential workers. One of the I don't know who he's supposed to be, one of the chiefs of staff or whatever, he says, if it meant that I could save the prosperity of the American people, I would gladly give my life or go up to outer space on the spaceship. And it immediately reminded me of the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who was like, I think a lot of grandparents would gladly sacrifice themselves if it meant a better world for their grandchildren. Everyone's like, okay, cool. How about you first, Dan?
Yeah, seriously.
Were there
Until
any
you
other
open
things
your
you
shit
noticed?
back up, Dan. um, let's see. Well, the funny thing about Robert Guillaume's character and the people within his home, I kept thinking your proximity to whiteness is not going to save you.
Exactly.
And I think that's an idea that some people think that, you know, if they're within this little bubble of whiteness, they're going to be okay, but you can't ever be so sure about that. So I thought that was pretty funny, and I also just thought it borrowed a lot from like black exploitation films in that way.
Hmm.
Of, I mean, it was Reagan, but I mean, it could have been, you know, Tricky Dick,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
so it could have been, you know, Richard Nixon. So I just appreciated that style. But I also wanted to just, again, thinking about music, you know, I don't know that there was a lot of notable music within that short, but if you
Hmm.
think about that series, Cosmic Slop, which is
Hmm.
a funkadelic record, and I mean, it's not like it doesn't tell this particular story, but it tells like stories of disenfranchisement and,
Hmm.
you know, like March to Witch's Castle. It's like about like Vietnam vets coming back from the war and
Right.
how they were received. And then there's just like there's like one song that's about like kids that like see their mom like having to like turn tricks to like, you know, make ends meet. So it's like it has a lot of those themes within, you know, from Born in Flames and from this movie within that album. So I was really curious as to why they picked that, but I guess, I mean, that makes sense, but I would want to know more about that.
About why they picked Cosmic Slop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. Cosmic Slop came out in what year? The
But the
album?
album, it's got to be like 70s,
Yeah, I
I would
think
say.
I do really like the sort of the tie-in with the album and 72, and sort of
And I think when we
using
think
George
about,
Clinton as the bard. Go ahead.
yeah, I think when we think about Afrofuturism
Hmm.
and you know, science fiction and the black figures, we have to think about Parliament Funkadelic, like, you know, all, like Bootsy Collins, like we have to think about all those people, you know, and I think that again, like a lot of black culture and black music has that element in it already. If we think of like
Right.
Earth, Wind, and Fire, like tell me they don't look like they're coming from another
The
planet or
whole the
something.
whole
So
point was that. Yeah, I think
so
there
yeah,
is a
so in some
certain.
ways we are the aliens.
No, I mean that's one of the things that I think why I picked Space Traders is there's this sort of embedded in the story and embedded in science fiction is um, this idea of people from elsewhere and the Black American experience having been uh, slave chattel and having been sort of dropped in this foreign place with little to no connection of where you came from, so that from as early as the earliest recorded sort of pieces of black art, particularly black music, they sort of thrived on these narratives of like an alien on a foreign planet, and being from a place from far away and potentially returning to that place. One of the more popular or more famous sort of black centric sci-fi films is Space is a Place by Sun Ra, or with Sun Ra. And
Mhm.
this, the premise of that is black people returning to a planet uh, far away from Earth to sort of recenter themselves and grow a new society. And this sort of um, I think what's interesting about Space Trader, going back to what Octavia Butler was talking about in terms of this sort of problematic absence of people in color. And, one of the things I always talk about whenever we're talking about sci-fi based in the future, produced by like mainstream white directors or production, is, you know, it's it's really sort of, it's not really fully understood how traumatic it is, I think, as a Black viewer of sci-fi, to see a film set in the future with no Black people in it. And there's something about white art and cultural creators that they don't, it's kind of bizarre that they don't understand the implications, because it's like the first thing I think about is, okay, what traumatic like earth catastrophe happened that eradicated Black people and they're no longer exist in the future. And I think what's interesting about Space Traders is that it sort of plays on that theme, but sort of rewinds and shows us what potentially might have happened before all these films with no Black people in the future, and takes us back to the actual traumatic event, and imagines this sort of repetition of history where, even in the future, people from outer space are still trading resources for Black people. What did you think about that element in the film?
Well, I think that it brings up two like interesting ideas for me. One being, when you ask people, do you want to trade places with Black people?
Yeah.
They can always like articulate that the experience of being Black is different and maybe hard. But then
Mhm.
there's also this idea that it's like that Black people have like a persecution complex at the same time,
Yeah.
which is always like very interesting to me. So when I was watching that, you could see it. Well, I mean, they'll be better off if they go
Hmm.
here. Like, wouldn't that solve all their problems? All these things. It's like
They always say they don't want to be
you
here.
know it's the experience is different.
Hmm.
You know all these things, but you can't understand why people would be upset or anything else. Like, which is just hilarious to me. Um, and then I guess I would just think about too, like how they brought up like the paper bag test. Again, it's
Hmm.
us, or I wouldn't say it's us policing ourselves, but you know, who was the person that presented the idea? It was a light-skinned Black
Of course.
doctor. And so it's just, and then and within that household of whatever Mr.
Their
Guillaume's
last in the film,
character
they're
was,
the Go Lightlies.
uh, yeah, it's like his wife was a light-skinned woman, and then his son's girlfriend was a white girl.
Hmm.
So like it was just interesting within that household, and I think towards the end when we see how they get separated, also very hilarious, and also just even the Black woman like in blackface was kind of funny to me for
Yeah.
some reason.
No, exactly. That was. I don't think I realized that at the first. I had to kind of rewind. Like I couldn't tell exactly what was happening, but then you realize I
Yeah,
was like,
the
that
video was
was
grainy.
hilarious. I don't know
It was
what,
very.
like, I kind of lost it when I saw that part, but it. I think they. I think to sort of compare it to um, Born in Flames, which is a more sort of a polemic. I think this is an attempt at sci-fi that is, again, kind of like we talked about with our discussion with Camp. There are multiple layers of what's going on, and none of them can be easily dismissed or siphoned off in different categories, because it's all happening at once. There's the humor. There is the sort of intercultural discussion. There's the sort of summit of Black leadership groups at the church, where they're all sort of discussing possible different approaches. There's a discussion of sort of Black capitalism as is sort of starting to erupt in a conversation, particularly in social media among Black people, and this idea that like capitalism won't save you, because Go Lightly's initial solution is to go to all of these white-owned companies and talk to them, eventually, essentially appeal to their fear of losing the Black consumer. And then there's the strategy of the sort of what's sort of like a stand-in for like kind of like the Rainbow Coalition, where their whole idea is to create basically an advertising campaign around like vote no on this initiative. And they have this Casey Kasem host this telethon with all these like, what would the world be like without Michael Jackson
Without
and Magic
Magic
Johnson
Johnson and Queen
and
Latifah.
Halle Berry?
Halle Berry. I loved that. That was just hilarious again.
That part was hilarious.
It's like, is that all the value that we have is our cultural output?
Yes.
because it kind of feels like you think
Yes
that.
is the answer.
And then that's the idea that once we're gone, who are you guys going to steal from?
Hmm.
Which I thought was hilarious as well.
There were
But
a lot
also
of
just that
things
flipping
about
of
it.
the script, their idea to say, oh, well, maybe this other planet or universe or whatever it is going to be better for us. Maybe it's going to be, maybe you guys are going to be jealous. And like, again, I think that goes back to that idea of they can't stand to have, they can't stand to see Black people have something that they can't have.
Exactly.
So that was like a funny idea. I knew it wouldn't work, but
Yeah,
again, I
knew
just
they were
thought it
just
was
gonna
like,
ignore him, but
right.
there was a
But I
really
thought it was just
interesting
funny
idea.
because again, you don't really see like I feel like bold ideas like that on
Right.
screen really.
No, I think the sort of the evocativeness of it and this the sort of just kind of like um, there's a certain sort of playful radicality to it, or radicalness, to the to what the sort of the Hudlin brothers set out to do, and I think it works on both on the level of shock value, and I think it also holds up to deeper analysis. I think even the sort of this hokey special effects actually works in conjunction with what they're trying to do, in the sense that, like, you know, there is there are real consequences, but in a sense, it's almost as if the sort of the the bad sort of early CGI is almost represents a white gaze, where there's it's all a bargain, it's all a game. It's like it's a bad video game. I think for the white people, and because it's the conversations they're all having are all theoretical, because either way they're going to be fine. And so I think there's a parallel between that and some of the conversations that happen in Born in Flames, in which when Adelaide has her conference with the white editors of the Socialist Review, and essentially she just gets fed up. She says, I knew you wouldn't understand. You're oppressed and you don't even know it. And so there is this sort of fuzzy gauze over the white gaze, in which they have all these sort of theoretical conversations, but they're not um, they're not connected to anything sort of flesh and blood, because whatever happens, even for a certain amount of time, they're going to be fine. And so the stakes are really low in sort of conversations they're having. And I think one of the things that is so special about Black sci-fi is that, and when Octavia Butler talks about the sort of positive disruption that centering Black people in science fiction brings to the narrative, is that it immediately raises the stakes to any sort of narrative involving the future or the implications of technology. And I think that's at the heart of why so many white filmmakers are reluctant to include it. And it's not they will frame it as this is derailing the content into this sort of racial text. But what's actually happening is they want to kind of play with their toys. They want to sort of play with this sort of idea of science fiction with no real consequences. And immediately, when you sort of center Black women, you raise the stakes, and all of a sudden your choices have consequences. Like, and obviously this is fantasy, but the dudes who do Game of Thrones, it's you have this completely made up world to play with, and somehow you still end up with Black and brown slaves in your show. And then the follow up that they wanted to do was, what if the
On
Confederacy had won the Civil War? And just like, are you crazy? What is your deal? And so there's a sense in which it's not, and this is sort of a central theme of this entire series. It's like the exclusion of Blackness from these genres and the lack of agency for Black filmmakers within these genres is not necessarily about this concept of diversity, like, oh, if there's more colors it makes the rainbow more beautiful. It's more about why these sort of lauded art forms are not living up to their full potential, why there's a certain quality missing, why there's a certain expertise and craft that's missing by excluding these you can't have political science without centering the politics of Blackness, in much the same way that you can't have science without biology. There is something that's being glossed over that's actually essential as opposed to ancillary.
And if we think again about the history of our nation, it's basically that everything that we did to become this nation was an antithesis of what we said we stood for.
Exactly.
So, but I think there's two things. I think, especially when you think about science fiction, again, being set in the future, technological advances, I think
Mm,
sometimes people think because we have succeeded and achieved so much with technology and through science, that we have somehow left the problems of the past in the past.
right.
And that's not true. It just isn't. And I also think, again, it's back to that blind spot of, well, if it doesn't affect me, it doesn't exist. And I think right now the perfect example is COVID-19.
Yep.
When people are like, well, I don't know anybody that has it. Oh, that's only affecting those Black and brown communities. Oh, well, I'm going to go to
Sorry.
Target with no mask on. Sorry.
Exactly.
So it's just like, if it doesn't affect me, it doesn't exist. And surely we don't have racism anymore. Have an iPhone.
Yes.
So
Take an
it's that.
iPhone.
So they go ahead and just keep telling the same story that they already know.
No, I think there is this ground level assumption that new technologies create new realities. And the reason the Black perspective is so important is because without it, you don't see the underlying truth, which is that new technologies actually repeat old realities, unless you address those realities first. And so I think, as the sort of central thesis of both of these films, actually, I think that I think there are ways in which Black science fiction is both explicitly wrestling with those things and implicitly, in terms of just the mere presence. It's you don't a film doesn't necessarily have to be as politically dynamic as Born in Flames, or as overtly satirical as Space Traders, to present to provide a platform to explore these issues. I think, and I don't want to say that I don't want to perpetuate tokenism, but I think the presence of certain characters within these films sort of present new planes if they're allowed to sort of operate in parallel with one another. But I mean,
I think so too, but I think we also have to think about the intention behind those
yes,
characters.
exactly.
Because I think where they were saying that, oh, well, race becomes the centralized, message or theme or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's like, no, it's not that. It's what is the intention behind this person's presence? It doesn't have to be about race. They could be anything, it could be
Right.
anything else. But if you're writing where you can only see their difference, then that's on you. It's not
It
on
is
them.
on you.
Because it's
And
weird, especially because as Black people, we have to understand all these other different worlds that we exist in. We just
right.
have to. So it's like, why can't you spend not even the same amount of energy that we spend on these things? Just a little bit of your energy on
Just a
these
little
things.
bit, just like a tiny bit. And I think that's reflected in the lack of Black directed science fiction film, and only in very recent years has it been more proliferation in terms of that. There's um, there's a Kenyan director, Wanuri Kahyu, who directed Rafiki. She has a short film called Pumzi that came out a few years ago. Just recently on Netflix, The Old Guard, directed by Gina Prince Bythewood, was actually the first major release comic book film directed by a Black woman. It's on Netflix now. I streamed it. It's pretty good. I was really impressed with the way she directed an action film with Charlize Theron and Kiki Lane from Beale Street. What's the full name of that movie? Something Beale Street. Oh God. But I think there is a direct thread from films like Born in Flames and 1993 Sankofa, which I actually wanted to potentially scream sometime in the future, but it's very hard to find. It's by Haile Gerima, who is an Ethiopian director, but he went to school at UCLA, so he's part of the LA Rebellion. That's a film about a model, I believe, who's doing a shoot in Ghana and gets transported back in time to a southern plantation. But it was a struggle finding Black directed sci-fi film, and I think what was cool about watching Born in Flames is, particularly the structure, which I thought was so like thinking about the painstaking process of the editing she does in the film it's out of control. It's so good. And I think, a lot of early reviews were, essentially, I think they understood the aesthetic, particularly sort of punk origins, but I think they, in some ways, sort of talked about it in terms of like her splicing of footage is a little bit disorienting. But I think it's almost become even more legible in the way that, sort of the way that we're watching films now, and particularly on TV with Random Acts of Flyness by Terrence Nance, and obviously Donald Glover's Atlanta. And I don't know if you've been watching I May Destroy You by
I
Michaela
haven't started
Coel.
watching it yet. I'm saving it.
No, it's fine. Save it fine, because it's not fully out yet. But the show is incredible. She's working in multiple genres at once. I would consider a lot of elements. I would sort of consider one of those genres to be science fiction, but she's dealing directly with sexual assault from a Black perspective. It's astounding. It's one of the best things I've ever seen. But it's, in watching the way those shows are not linear, the way they mix a number of different mediums. Sorry, my camera should come back. But in a way, it makes what Boredom was doing, it makes it easier to sort of recognize exactly where she's going, because the narrative makes a lot of sense. I think the sort of meticulous way in which it's constructed creates a very cohesive story. And I think it's, although she is white, I think it highlights what can happen and what the possibilities are when you include different storytelling traditions. There's a really good talk that Haile Gerima gave at a Black film, I think it's called the Black Star Film Fest in Philly, where there was a screening of Sankofa, and it's a talk back after that. And he talks about how disorienting it is for young Black filmmakers to sort of be forced to fit in this Hollywood mode, particularly with the sort of essentially made up sort of 3-act structure of films. And he calls that just sort of basically one of the enemies of filmmaking and
It
script
reminds me
writing.
of writing essays for standardized tests.
Exactly.
Like intro paragraph, closing
Yes,
paragraph,
closing
three in the middle.
paragraph. Did you do the inverted pyramid of like
Yeah,
the like getting more specific? It's insane,
yeah.
and it screws with Black artists' mind, because all of our storytelling traditions are non-linear and non-restrictive and not limited to this to not even limited in terms of temporal space. A lot of our traditions have to do with these sort of like parallel planes of past and present and future, and all of those things lend itself to making incredible sci-fi. literature,
Yeah.
in a number of different mediums. And
That
I think,
makes me think of the church that you're in. So in Space Traders, the church, you know, where everybody has like time at the pulpit, but like
yes,
I feel like the church is one of those places where the past and the present really
yeah,
like hit butt heads, and especially when you think of like old spirituals that like slaves sang and things like that, and just the like white supremacist nature of of
of
Christianity. So
Christianity in
I thought
general.
there was just a lot within those church scenes just in general. And I was, for some reason, I was waiting for an assassination to happen in the church.
They did feel like they were setting that up, but I think that's
Especially
also
when
the
that
part of
dude
the
like
setting.
stood up, when
You
he
thought
stood
maybe
up,
that was, yeah, yeah.
the dude from Friday. Was that the dude from Friday? It
Maybe
looked like him, but the footage was so
there was
grainy I could
some. It
not
was
tell.
hard to. There were some cameos. I know the guy with the brown taster paper bag. That was Rusty Conduff, who did
Yeah.
See
He was
Before.
with
Is that the right?
yeah,
The
I think
Yeah,
so.
with Chris Rock. That's funny. I was actually just thinking about him when we were talking about camp and satire. But yeah, I think the church, and you know, it's. I was thinking about the church as a site for sort of intergenerational conversation. I was also, there are Honey's monologues are beautiful, but there are multiple ones in Born in Flames where she brings up biblical imagery. I think she, one of the opening ones, she says, "But we are the children of the light, and we will continue to fight not against flesh and blood, but against a system that names itself falsely." I don't know what verse that is in the Bible, but it is about, if there's a verse, I think it's New Testament about, our fight is not against flesh and blood, but about spiritual warfare. And then she has another
Well, that
one.
makes sense because I mean,
Yeah,
when you
go
think
ahead.
about Christianity and like the blood of Christ and the
Hmm.
body of Christ, like that was the sacrifice, was the body. And I think in movements that are fighting oppression, that is the
That is
sacrifice,
the
the
sacrifice.
body.
There is a lot. I think that's why I think, whenever you employ this kind of imagery, there is a science fiction quality to, like you were saying, to like the church as a meeting point, um, and the church as a site of resistance. And so there's this duality between, like you said, the white supremacist application of and exploitation of religion in terms of subjugating peoples, and colonialism, um, juxtaposed with the fact that, once people were allowed to read the Bible themselves, there is a lot of proverbial knowledge about political resistance, and how the flesh and blood, like spiritual warfare, that's easily transposed to this sort of, um, the misdirection of the police state, and how the
Mhm.
police state wears these sort of like shrouds of disguise and has you fighting the wrong enemies. It's like you know the central tactic of police states is to create these sort of straw men, and like they have
Right.
this sort of like ghostly specter, the surveillance, always being there but not necessarily being there. And then I think at the end, towards the end of the film, it might be Honey's last monologue, where she talks, it's basically her rallying cry, and she talks about putting on the full armor, which is, another biblical reference to again, to like protecting the physical body, as a metaphor for protecting the spiritual
Protecting the
body.
spirit. Hmm. I
Um,
concur. I concur. Yeah, it's crazy too, because when you think about modern applications of Christianity, it's like, and the division with race, it's like it seems like it's prosperity gospel over here, and
yes,
there's a
yes.
faction of Black Christianity that's going in that direction.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if you think about like a lot of the Southern tradition, then it's still praise instead of worship,
Yes,
if that
yes,
makes
yes,
sense.
yes,
Like
absolutely.
everything else is just worship, but
Hmm.
it's still praise.
Yeah, I think, and again, going along with, the soundtrack for the music, it's just like it's all so deeply embedded. And I think what is particularly interesting about Black perspectives on sci-fi regarding religion is in sort of white secular uh, ideas of science, and therefore science fiction, the biblical premises and concepts are the enemy of science. This
Mm-hmm.
sort of the central conflict between our, Texas schools is, the Bible versus science, creationism versus uh, what the other one is, evolution.
Evolution.
uh, but I think what is so powerful about Black art is that we've never been afraid to discuss them in tandem. We've never considered them as sort of what's the word, is sort of concrete dichotomies, and
Right.
constant, rather than being in constant opposition to one another. It is possible to sort of form a sort of cosmology around multiple perceptions of the way we view the world, whether that's and that has a lot to do with not creating such a firm delineation between the spiritual and the physical, which you can see as far back as you were talking about. It's the central text of Negro spirituals, is that this idea that the spirit and the body not only coexist, but they should be studied as if they have equal impact on what we conceive of as the natural world.
Especially when you think, again, Christianity, and who was it that hung Jesus on the cross? It
Yeah,
was soldiers.
it was soldiers.
I was like, the devil was somewhere around there, but it was
Exactly.
soldiers. So it's like, it's always been political. It's always been a
Mm-hmm.
social movement. You haven't you failed to recognize that.
Yes.
And it's always been, again, used in conflict with itself. Like
Mm,
when you think of colonialism and, missions and all those things where, they've come and everybody has to become a Christian. That's fascism.
exactly.
That's a little bit of fascism if you think about it. So yeah, so it's like it's all in there. It's just what you choose to see
Right.
and how you reduce things.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a central theme throughout this series, and even in the next 2 weeks, is there is the exclusion or lack of recognition of Black art in particular genres. It always starts to uh, it always starts from a reduced impression of what Blackness brings to the table.
Mm-hmm.
There is a certain um, it's easy to exclude someone when you reduce them down to some whatever you feel is essential into this sort of tiny circle. Um,
Mm-hmm. Which
so,
also means that you're making that essential. Like you are making that the rule,
mm-hmm.
and you're unaware that you are. So it's like you're being a fascist. You're being the oppressor in that because you've created this rule, and
Mm-hmm.
and you can't break it.
No, I think that's true. I think there's
Like
a
all of it is the choice. It might be a passive choice, but it's still a choice.
and that has a lot to do with science fiction in terms of, like, the scientific method. There's, it starts with a hypothesis, and then if all goes well, it turns into a law of science. And there's a way in which this, film and the way we think about film is its own science. And as we decide who belongs and who doesn't, as we decide, as one dominant culture decides all of the essential properties of certain things, as what intellectual molecules make up Black artists, then they're actually in real time inscribing those into laws about how we think about stuff like film, and how we think about different, the uses of different thematic classifications.
I also think that if we take that same kind of line of thought and apply it to Catherine Bigelow,
Yeah, let's talk a second about Catherine
you think
Bigelow.
about her, winning an Academy Award for The Hurt Locker, which is a
Yeah,
movie about state-sanctioned violence.
yeah,
And she also did that like movie with Keanu Reeves. Like it's just like a theme in her work of
yeah. She did.
police and
Yeah.
military. What is
What's the
that?
Keanu Reeves?
Blue
I don't know
something?
what. Point Break. She did
Oh,
Point
Point Break.
Break.
There we go. Yeah.
She has a really interesting history with with this with science fiction too, because
Hmm.
she did she did what's the vampire movie that she did, Near Dark, which is sort of like a science fiction fantasy, like vampire western. She also did a movie, I think, in the mid '90s called with Angela Bassett, Strange Days. It's a sci-fi film set in futuristic, uh, I don't know, New York, I think, with that was also written by James Cameron, who is her ex-husband. So she has an interesting background with science fiction, not only being temporarily married to James Cameron, but also, um, in her perspective on genre film in general. She's one of the few uh, women directing films in Hollywood whose work is almost extensively in genre film, and she's been pretty successful at it. Um, but I think, and actually one of the first things I thought about. So there is an actor, I don't remember her name, but there's an actor in Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark who plays one of the vampires in the original sort of squad, and she's white, she's blonde, and I kept thinking she looks so familiar, and then I looked her up, and she's in Aliens, James Cameron's Aliens, and she plays Rodriguez, the Latina. She plays the Latina soldier in Aliens, and she's in brownface. I was
Oh God.
I couldn't believe I didn't know that. Like, I had only seen Aliens twice, and I only found like maybe 2 articles written about how that was problematic. But I mean, it just highlights like on how we take certain film depictions at face value. I mean, Aliens came out in like '89. This is like decades after blackface was cool. Like it's I was shocked, and I think
But
it
hey,
makes so much sense that I got away with it in science fiction.
if we're thinking about that time though, and we
Hmm.
think about like the Prime Minister of Canada and like all these people that had
Yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
like their blackface like photos, I
Hmm.
feel like that was
It's
the
true.
time when
That
that
was
shit was
the era. It
popular.
was like
It
blackface
was
was happening,
popping
and
for
we didn't
some
really know.
reason.
It was popping in certain populations, and we didn't
Yeah.
necessarily know. That was actually shocking, and it's no surprise that went under the radar in science fiction, because there's this anything goes kind of element. And I remember watching Aliens, which a lot of people, that's their favorite in the trilogy. It's not personally
Mhm.
mine, but I just remember how bad her dialogue was, and like she would just sort of randomly, very clunkily, just throw in random Spanish words, and I was like, how is this Latina actress letting this happen? Turns out she's not. That's why that happened. But I mean, it's you know this is also funny thinking of the Alien series, because one of the very few sort of notable moments of Black people in mainstream sci-fi Hollywood. The actor and artist who played the original Alien in costume was Badejo, and he was a Nigerian actor um, who was 6'10", so that's why they chose him for the role. But
Wow.
he didn't repeat the role in any of the other ones, because they started using puppets. And I think he died pretty early from sickle cell. Um,
Mm.
but there's some really good photos online of him in costume. And it's such an
My
interesting
earliest
role too for
memory
him.
of science fiction is
Uh-huh.
some white boy calling me the predator because I had
Wow.
braids.
Oh my God.
I just remembered that.
I mean, that's the very rich text in terms of like the Predator. I don't remember who made that film, but I think
Me
Shane
neither.
Black wrote it maybe. But the choice to essentially have these alien dreads in Predator, a Nigerian actor playing Alien, and sort of this, our initial one of the original film, the 1940 film I mentioned, Son of Ngagi, which is a reference to this other super racist film about uh, giving white women as slaves to these 8 people. So there's like our the initial place, only place we had in sci-fi was as this sort of othered villain, this sort of like alien specter, this this unstoppable predator that is just sort of terrorizingly efficient. So there's a
I
lot
guess it was a
to play
compliment
with
then.
there. Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, you're so dangerous.
Yeah.
And I that's one of the reasons why I love Blade, in that I love this idea of a black superhero who, again, is a mix of certain things. He's a day walking vampire who is, essentially protecting white people from these creatures
And it
that were
also
originally the
proves
only
that
thing we were depicted as.
there is a market for these.
Yes,
When
I
we
mean, a
think
lot of
about
people don't
Blade, when we
know.
think about Black Panther, like all these things, like they did far greater than
uh,
expectations.
Wesley
And I
Snipes is
wonder
so
what that is.
cool. No,
Yeah.
it's exactly right. I think the old guard, I think, is doing well. It had a really good opening release on Netflix, and a lot of people don't know that Blade was the first official film put out by Marvel. There have been
Yeah, I
previous
didn't know that.
crossover, but Marvel, as a film production studio, that Blade was the first film. Um, and I think there is, like you said, the marketability has always been there, but there's a certain gatekeeping that happens for various reasons, all of them bogus.
Mhm.
Um,
I also think that people think that there has to be some sort of scientific intelligence that to have to be able to write this. Like you need to
Absolutely.
like understand like quantum
Hmm.
mechanics or some shit like that, which it's all
No.
like the thing about science and a lot of these things are their laws of nature. And
Hmm.
I think people who have seen the worst of humanity know a lot about the laws of
Exactly.
nature.
And exactly. I think that's exactly the gatekeeping that's happening, where it's, you set up these boundaries of science fiction that have to do with hard, quote, hard sciences, which is just another sort of white supremacist way of making
Gatekeeping,
these
keeping
things
people out.
finite.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and I think it also is a way of rejecting areas of expertise that tend to be dominated by Black people, as like you said, sort of studying the laws of nature, the political and the social sciences. There's a reason why those aren't given primacy, because it maintains this space that sort of white patriarchy has carved out for itself,
Mhm.
um, in art.
And ignores so much more like work that started long before
Exactly.
like like white men were there. Like if you think about like pyramids and all these other things, it's like
Uh-huh.
it's always been here. It's always been here, and that wasn't y'all.
I know they love to credit. There's like, that's their favorite theory, is that aliens did the pyramids, and you're like, you know
Yeah.
what? Not only
They rather
were they
give it
real
to the
people, but
aliens.
we're exactly. It's like that's
Rather
what
give it to
Butler
ET.
was talking about too, which is like, for a professor. I just can't imagine the way Butler described it. I'm just like, these type of like gaslighting microaggressions are happening today and
Yes.
in
It's amazing to
modern
have
literature
that
courses.
restraint though when you hear these types of
Ugh,
arguments. Like when I watch her, when I watch like James Baldwin and people like that, just they just have so much patience.
so much patience, and I think that there's
And empathy, I would say.
I think the empathy is really major. And I think that, empathy breeds patience, I think, in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
The juxtaposition I've been noticing recently, you watch old appearances on like the Dick Cavett show with James Baldwin, and he's so composed in his responses, and he's so measured in the way that he responds. And you compare that to, there's a documentary on Netflix that one of my housemates was watching, and it's about the debates between uh, Gore Vidal and who's the other conservative? Who is the conservative?
I don't want to
Just
say
recently,
William Burroughs, but I
it
can't keep
is. It
saying
is Burroughs.
it is
It's
okay.
it's no, it's not Burroughs. Sorry, it's Buckley, William F.
Okay,
Buckley. So
there we
the famous televised debates about them, and uh, you compare that sort of that composed like constitution to, after think about like 10 minutes into the debate with Gord Vidal, Buckley gets so mad he just calls him a queer on national TV, and there's this sort of
Wow.
like um, lack of restraint, and I think it's there's a you can see it in a lot of Black approaches to filmmaking too. I think there is a certain there's a measured approach, not only because of the ways in which we know that we're perceived, but the ways there's a certain meticulousness to the way that we approach storytelling that is uh, inherently geared towards providing multiple perspectives, and I think that's a really powerful thing that we bring to the table.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking that when you think about science, one of the first things you're supposed to do is forget what you know or assume
Mm-hmm.
you know nothing. And I think when Black storytellers tell stories, they assume their audience knows nothing. So they set
Yes.
the table. But with white audiences and white theorists, they assume they know everything and they don't
Mm-hmm.
start from a position of vulnerability or willingness to accept anything. And I think when you see him lash out and call him queer, that's the only thing he knows that's true
Exactly.
right now.
That's
So
exactly
that's
right.
why he has to use that.
It is. It's like you, and I think, towards that end there is there's a humility in certain art making traditions where it's like not only are you assuming that your audience knows nothing, not only are you putting yourself into that headspace, but you're also comfortable working and creating at a deficit of knowledge. There is this uh, there's this way in which Black storytelling and just the Black cultural experience in which we I think one of the things that makes us such powerful imaginers of the future is that we're comfortable being in a state where we have no control over our futures, where uh, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. We don't know uh, we don't have a lot of social agency to determine what's going to happen in the future. And I think that puts you in a particular sort of um, cosmic space where it allows you to tell more imaginative stories. It allows you to expand your limits of what's possible um, when you're not in a position to go to work and know that you're going to be compensated fairly, or to apply for a job and have a pretty good idea that you're going to get it, to know exactly where your next meal is coming from. Um, so I think, again, there's a certain kind of perspective of humility that I think is missing, like you said, from most work in science fiction.
I like it.
What do you think? You have any other thoughts? Any other sci-fi Black sci-fi moments that you remember?
No, I can't think of anything right now.
There aren't that many,
Unless you want to talk
honestly.
about the Nutty Professor.
That's actually a good one. I haven't thought about that movie in
I haven't either. I don't
wow.
even know that I watched it in its entirety, but
Which in itself
uh,
is a remake, which I think I also
yeah.
think that's another interesting thing that we're gonna kind of run into in just talking about Black genre film, is that so much of our first entries into these genres were remakes of white centric films, and The Night Professor is a really good example of that. Um, and
And
that
it's also
obviously gets into
interesting
a lot of other
when we think
issues.
about now because everything is a remake or a reboot too. So it
Uh-huh.
was like with Black storytelling, it was always like that one like
Yes.
myopic view of what it could be, and
Uh-huh.
now that's
That's
the
the norm now.
the reality for
Uh-huh.
everyone now, which is what we've been saying this
We've
whole
been saying that all the time. And
time.
and you think about the Black, like Black music traditions where we've turned remixes into its own art form. There's this sort of constant riffing we do that is, in a lot of ways, has been, like you said, appropriated by Hollywood. There's
Mhm.
this idea of the old is new, but like you said, there's a certain sort of white patriarchy perspective that doesn't allow for a lot of reimagination. There's this sort of like weird, like very odd, strict adherence to the original text.
Yeah.
That
Well, like when Trump said, "Whatever happened to Gone with the Wind?"
exactly,
I think that's like
exactly.
the perfect example of that.
It was
Where
like
like we got to stick to this. I
hold
remember when they
on.
were mammies and in the fields looking like shadows. Can we get back
Yes,
to that, please?
yes. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect sort of, uh, there are all kinds of discussions about, science fiction and the emergence of comic books, and like there are all sorts of like movie nerds getting very angry about the lack of originality. Um, and it's, there's a way in which, you know, black art is the cure for stale material in a way in which it
It
always
really
it
is.
always has. And like whether you want to create something new out of almost thin air, or you want to make something that is such an innovative uh, recreation of something that's already exists, that it stands on its own 2 feet, I think you should probably hire someone black if that's what you're looking for.
I was also thinking just now too about Star Wars and Spider-Man and all these things where they casually mention maybe we'll get a black person to do this, and then all the nerds on the internet get so mad, or
They
like
get
John
so
Boyega,
angry.
and like
That's a
how
whole
like
other
they
thread.
like for fighting with him, and like yeah, it's just insane. Like why can't there be a black Spider-Man? You know? Like
Because it derails Spider-Man. It derails the narrative of Spider-Man if you make him black.
well, I will say that I'm enjoying Ironheart.
What's that? Tell me about Ironheart.
That's the Iron Man with Riri
Oh,
Williams.
is
Yeah.
it? Have you been reading it?
Yeah.
Wait, who's writing it? You said?
Eve Ewing, I think.
Oh yeah, I've haven't read a lot of her text, but I follow her on Twitter. She's
Same.
awesome. How many installments of Ironheart are there
I think
so far?
there's two, and there's one that's about to come out or already came out. I can't
Okay,
remember.
that's a good recommendation. I want to, and I think what I'm gonna do specifically for sci-fi is I think I'm gonna have on one of Hyperreal's platforms and my platforms just sort of put out a long recommend. I mean, I think at the end of this series, I'm going to put out a longer recommendation list, but I want to put out the sci-fi one now. I think just because it's one of those. I think of all of the genres we'll probably cover in the next 4 weeks, it's the least represented by Black filmmakers, and there's a lot of really good work that is emerging in new platforms. Everyone should stream The Old Guard. I think it's not only do I think it's worth watching, I think in blatant capitalist terms, it is worth funneling your money to someone like Gina Prince Bythewood for her work. And I like what she's doing. Um, I think the platform could be really powerful. I think they're already setting it up to be a franchise. The author Joe, I think his first name's Joe. His last name's Rocca. He wrote the graphic novel material for the series, for the film, as a trilogy. It centers around these sort of ancient warriors who are immortal or semi-immortal, and throughout time they sort of find each other and uh, fight battles that they think will make the world a better place, essentially. And Lane, the character, she's a black, obviously she's black, she's a Marine, who finds out that she's one of them, and so it takes off from there. But it's a very cool premise. I do think it's worth a look. And I think, unless you want to discuss something else, I think that's mostly what I got. I don't even know where we're at right now.
I think it's been a
We've been talking for a
good
while.
minute.
Yeah. But thanks for joining me again, and
No problem. Thanks for having me.
carrying me across the finish line as usual.
You
Is
got
there any?
two good ones so far.
We
I've enjoyed it.
got some great ones. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's always great to nerd about movies with you. Um, what anything you're working on that you want to plug? Any content you got going on?
I'm working on a podcast. Don't want to say too much about it. I'm working
Oh, that's right.
on
Okay, cool.
some web stuff. Don't want to say too much about it, but
I love
hopefully I'll
it.
have some content to kick out here before the end of the year.
Good. Stay tuned. What's your at again?
At too fat too fly TOOPHATTOOFLY.
Perfect.
And then at Ronnie Wood on Instagram, Ronnie WOULT.
Got it. That about wraps it up. Thank you again. This you should be listening to this on Friday. Stay tuned for next week's edition where we will be covering romantic comedy. So we'll announce the film Sunday, and then again we'll post our roundtable discussion the following Friday. Thanks again to Hyperreal Film Club for hosting, and we'll see you next time.